They called him the wisest man who ever lived. But Solomon's greatness didn't come from his crown, his kingdom, or the gold that overflowed from his treasury. It came from something far less visible, the way he thought. Before the temples, before the scrolls, before the world bowed to his decisions, there was a man who asked for one thing, not power, not fame, but wisdom. And that single choice made in the quiet of his youth altered the fate of a nation. Solomon didn't become a legend by chance. He engineered his life by choosing understanding over ego, discernment over dominance. While others begged for armies, he begged for insight. And that tells you everything about the man behind the myth. Because Solomon knew something most men never realize, that a kingdom isn't built with bricks. It's built with decisions. And the quality of your decisions depends entirely on the clarity of your perception. Most people live inside a fog, reacting, guessing, repeating. Solomon, he lived above it. He saw patterns others missed. He read between human emotions like lines on a sacred scroll. He understood that to truly rule anything, like whether it's a city, a business, or your own mind, you must first learn to pause before you act. That is wisdom's first commandment. Resist reaction. Think of the moment when two women came before him, both claiming to be the mother of one child. There were no witnesses, no DNA, just one problem and one king. He didn't panic. He didn't consult an oracle. He watched. He listened. And then he did something shocking. He called for the child to be divided. A sword would settle the matter, but it wasn't a solution. It was a test. And the real mother revealed herself not with words, but with sacrifice. She would rather lose the child than see it harmed. That was Solomon's genius, that he didn't seek truth in what people said. He watched how they behaved. Ed under pressure. Wisdom, he knew, isn't loud. It reveals itself when emotion fades. In a world that worships information, Solomon teaches us to worship interpretation. He wasn't smarter because he had more knowledge. He was wiser because he asked better questions. Where others sought answers, he sought perspective. That's the secret. Wisdom begins not with knowing, but with asking. And the question he asked God, grant your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, wasn't a plea for intelligence. It was a request to see deeper, to read motives, to feel timing, to sense what isn't said. That's the level of perception that separates the powerful from the truly influential. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just spiritual, it was strategic. He built alliances not through domination, but through marriage. He wrote proverbs that still cut through modern noise like knives. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. He didn't say as a man acts, he said thinks, because he understood that action is downstream of thought. Control the internal and the external bends in response. He didn't need armies to move people. His words did what weapons couldn't. They reshaped minds. But the brilliance of Solomon isn't just in what he built, it's in what he avoided. He avoided the trap of certainty. He remained a student even as a king. That's where most people fall. They succeed a little and suddenly they stop listening. Not Solomon. He knew that the minute you stop questioning your assumptions, you've already begun your fall. Because pride disguises itself as clarity, and wisdom is humility in motion. And here's what modern life doesn't tell you. Being smart doesn't make you wise. Being successful doesn't mean you're making the right decisions. Wisdom is learning what not to pursue, what to delay, what to endure in silence. Solomon wasn't flawless. His fall proves that, but it also proves something deeper. Even the wisest among us must constantly guard against the erosion of clarity. He started by listening to heaven. He ended by listening to his own desires. That's the final lesson of part one. Wisdom isn't something you get once, it's something you practice daily, or it slips away unnoticed, like sand through your fingers. Solomon didn't raise an empire with armies, he raised it with awareness. While kings fortified borders, Solomon fortified understanding. He didn't chase power the way others did. He built a gravitational field of influence so strong that rulers traveled thousands of miles just to sit in his presence and ask him questions. They weren't coming for silver, they were coming for silence, the kind of silence only possessed by someone who knows more than he says. The Queen of Sheba brought spices, gold, and riddles, but what she truly brought was curiosity, and what she left with was awe, not at Solomon's palace, but at his presence. That's the paradox of true wisdom. It doesn't scream, it doesn't perform, it emanates. And Solomon understood that the strongest kind of authority is the one that doesn't need to announce itself. He could disarm men with a parable, break down conflict with a question, transform insult into insight. He lived by one unbreakable law, perception over projection, because when you project, you chase validation. But when you perceive, you understand value. And once you understand value, well, whether of time, truth, people, or decisions, you become unshakable. Every day, Solomon watched the most dangerous force in the world. Eldad moved quietly through his kingdom, emotion. Not armies, not enemies, emotion. He knew that wars begin with wounded pride, betrayal begins with unmet expectation, collapse begins with neglected wisdom. And so he taught through proverbs, short sentences with deep roots. A soft answer turns away wrath. That's not passivity, that's strategy. Because wisdom doesn't always conquer by force. It diffuses, it dissolves before it detonates. That's a language the world has forgotten. Solomon mastered that language. And not just for politics, for people. He could read faces the way some read scripture. He could see insecurity hiding behind boldness. He could sense lies wrapped in flattery. Why? Because he didn't listen to what people said. He listened to what they meant. That's the level of discernment most people never develop because they're too busy reacting. Solomon didn't react. He received. And then he responded from a deeper place, one where emotion had been filtered through truth. He was fluent in contradiction. He could hold two opposing truths and still move forward. He knew that justice sometimes requires mercy, that leadership sometimes means stepping back, that being feared isn't the same as being respected. He didn't confuse control with influence. He understood that one fades while the other multiplies. That's why his wisdom lasted longer than his rule, because real power doesn't die with the man. It spreads through the minds he changed. And here's what they won't teach you in school. Solomon's greatest asset wasn't his mind. It was his restraint, his ability to not speak, not act, not defend. The modern world rewards noise. Solomon mastered stillness. He made silence speak louder than speeches. And in that silence, he found answers no army could deliver. Because sometimes the highest wisdom is knowing when to let time reveal what your words never could. He could read people like scripture, but it didn't make him immune to heartbreak. He married hundreds of women, not out of lust, but diplomacy, each union a treaty, each partner a piece of strategy. But even a wise king can overextend. He began to bend the rules he once wrote. Piece by piece, he drifted. And that's the paradox. The wisest man in the world still made mistakes. But that doesn't disqualify the wisdom. It deepens it, because true insight isn't proven by never falling. It's proven by what you do after you've fallen. Solomon's story is a warning. Knowledge is power, but unguarded wisdom becomes a weapon, especially when it's aimed inward. He began his reign in surrender, asking God for guidance. He ended it building temples to idols he once denounced. How does that happen? Slowly, subtly, through exhaustion, through ego, through distraction disguised as expansion. When you're the smartest man in every room, who corrects you? Who questions your drift? Who anchors your ambition? The tragedy wasn't just that he changed, it's that he knew better. That's what makes his story more than a lesson. It makes it a mirror, because most people don't fall because they were weak. They fall because they stopped recentering. Solomon drifted from the source of his wisdom, not suddenly, but degree by degree. And that's the final enemy of greatness, distance, not from others, from yourself. But here's what redeemed Solomon's story. He documented the fall. He wrote Ecclesiastes not as a king flexing his fortune, but as a man unraveling meaning. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That wasn't bitterness. That was brutal honesty, a confession from someone who had tasted every pleasure, built every structure, ruled every room, and still found the echo of emptiness inside it. That's not defeat. That's insight most people run from. He wasn't preaching despair, he was teaching discernment. That success without anchoring is a mirage. That motion without purpose is just elegant distraction. That when everything is within your grasp, it's easy to lose what actually matters. And in that admission, we see the highest level of wisdom, the kind that turns its gaze inward. Because Solomon knew the secret no one wants to say out loud. Wisdom isn't freedom from failure. It's the awareness of the cost. It's knowing how easily we betray ourselves in the name of progress, how often we silence that quiet voice inside just to keep the applause going outside. That's what makes his fall so universally human. He didn't collapse because he was blind. He collapsed because he saw too much and forgot to protect the one thing that made him great, his alignment. When you study Solomon's journey, you realize that wisdom is a living thing. It has to be fed, not just learned. It doesn't come from collecting quotes or reading proverbs. It comes from how you live, how you decide, how you recalibrate when success starts to echo louder than truth. And that recalibration, it's not glamorous. It's not loud. It's usually done in the dark, when no one's clapping, when no one's watching, so except you. So if you want to carry Solomon's wisdom, don't just memorize his words. Feel the weight of his silence. Notice how the man who could write 1,000 truths still stumbled. Let that humble you. Let that sharpen you, because your greatest enemy will never be ignorance. It will be forgetting the voice that first made you wise. Long after Solomon's palace crumbled, after the cedar beams rotted and the gold tarnished, his voice remained. Not in the echoes of the throne room, but in the pages of those who listened. His legacy wasn't architecture, it was architecture of the mind. He built a framework for living that couldn't be torn down, a blueprint not for kingdoms, but for clarity. And maybe that's the secret he always knew, that the real empire you rule is internal, that every decision, every word, every delay is either construction or collapse, that your thoughts shape your future with more power than any army. Because when Solomon spoke of wisdom crying out in the streets, he wasn't describing something elusive. He was describing something ignored, something loud but drowned out by the noise of impulse and pride. He understood that insight is always available, but rarely chosen. People don't fail because they lack advice. They fail because they refuse to pause, refuse to observe, refuse to admit they don't see clearly. Solomon didn't confuse intelligence with perception. He lived in observation, not assumption. Even now, thousands of years later, his words read like he's sitting beside you, whispering truths you already knew but forgot how to name. Guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. That's not poetry. That's protection, because Solomon knew whatever owns your heart owns your decisions, and whatever owns your decisions owns your life. It's not enough to want change. You have to monitor what's feeding your emotions or your attention, your habits, your inner dialogue, because the battlefield of wisdom isn't public, it's private. The world will tell you to build fast. Solomon reminds you to build deep. The world says grow bigger. Solomon asks, grow where? Because it's possible to rise quickly and rot quietly. That's what he meant when he wrote, better a patient man than a warrior. He wasn't anti-ambition, he was anti-chaos. And in a world addicted to speed, his wisdom is rebellion, a call to slow down, see further, and decide like a king, not react like a prisoner. He never claimed perfection. He recorded his flaws. He watched his own descent. And in doing so, he left us something far more powerful than success, reflection. The kind of reflection that forces you to question everything you're chasing. Are you building what matters, or are you building for applause? Are you choosing clarity or comfort? Are you acting from conviction or convenience? Solomon's greatness wasn't that he always chose well. It's that he taught us how to choose better. And maybe that's the final piece. Wisdom isn't knowing all the answers. It's knowing which questions never stop mattering. Questions like, what does this decision become? What am I allowing into my heart today? Am I feeding truth or feeding ego? These are the quiet filters that make ordinary lives extraordinary, and no title, no diploma, no dollar amount replaces them. Because if Solomon taught us anything, it's that wisdom isn't inherited. It's practiced daily, quietly, relentlessly. So you don't need a crown to think like a king. You need clarity. You don't need a temple to leave a legacy. You need alignment, and you don't need to be Solomon to carry what he carried. You just need to return to stillness, return to questions, return to that silent place where truth lives before the world gets too loud. That's where wisdom begins, and that's where it waits for the few who still know how to listen